Westerns are cool, right? They're like the Knights of America, the samurais of the West. They're as American as apple pie and as cool as Clint Eastwood when he's not talking to chairs.
I wondered about, what?
Everyone, please take your seats, otherwise Clint Eastwood will yell at them.
But with their overabundance in cinema, it's only natural that eventually Westerns would spill over into video games.
2009's Call of Juarez Bound in Blood is the sequel to 2006 Call of Juarez. And by sequel, I mean prequel, because if you hadn't played the first one, you really wouldn't know.
Bound in Blood opens with two brothers, Ray and Thomas McCall, pointing guns at each other in a dramatic classic Mexican standoff. A gunshot is heard,
but just who shot who at the Copacabana?
And we're thrust back years prior to the Civil War, and you guessed it, the two brothers are on the losing side.
Because what better way to make you identify with the two main characters than making them support owning people as property?
Now, I know what a lot of you, the South will rise again types, are saying, that the Civil War wasn't actually a war regarding slavery, that's just Northern propaganda and something states' rights. But look at the brothers' homestead. That's what you call a plantation, and I'll be the first to fight you if you say that those fields are tended by a workforce being paid a livable wage. The brothers desert in order to protect said homestead, and they make an enemy of Barnsby, their former general. Years later, they hear rumors of an Aztec treasure in Juarez and go after it with Barnsby on their tail.
For all you aspiring writers out there, if you're trying to make your villain intimidating, maybe don't name him Barnsby. It's like calling him Foghorn Leghorn. It's really bad. It's really bad. He has a mullet and like a handlebar mustache.
Wait, who, Barnsby or Foghorn Leghorn?
Barnsby. He's like, they do like reveals of him, like you're like, oh no, he was behind it all, and he's like, it was me, McCalls, and you're like, Jesus. This game's just so bad, and everybody just looks dead inside.
And that's a big problem for the entirety of Bound in Blood. Everything feels a little first draft. The character names, the dialogue, the entire premise really. If everything had just a little bit more polish, I'd be more willing to overlook glaring gameplay issues because I'd be invested in the story. But line deliveries are either overly dramatic or primed to give you splinters because of how wooden they are, and characters have little depth or redeeming qualities, and honestly, situations just feel cliche.
But because of how heavily it borrows from other Westerns, if I were to criticize parts of the story, I'd actually be criticizing better examples of the genre.
Just off the top of my head, we have the character design of Appaloosa, the Confederate veteran aspect of 3:10 to Yuma, and the Hunt for Gold of the Dollar Trilogy. That's not me spitballing, these are all films that the developers cited as an influence. And similar influences are seen in games like Red Dead Redemption. But where Bound in Blood chooses to use that as a blueprint and following it carefully, Redemption uses it as a stepping stone, a jumping off point to create interesting characters, environments, and gameplay that stands on its own, while recognizing where it came from. Again, with a little more polish, Bound in Blood could have created a story that didn't feel, well, generic.
If you haven't noticed already, the game's a fairly standard first-person shooter where at the beginning of each level you can either pick Ray, who has dynamite and can dual wield, or Thomas, who has a lasso, bow, knives, and can make more precise shots.
For the majority of the game, I chose Thomas because in open environments, enemies are tricky to see, and being able to zoom with every gun is a big help. However, there's no real way to tell which brother would be best in the level you're going into, so it would be natural to just pick your favorite throughout. The problem is you'd only be upgrading one brother's guns, and towards the end you're forced to pick another, putting you in the late game with the worst weapons. That's not necessarily a criticism of the game, but it's definitely a problem with how the game is laid out. I do, however, really like how Thomas zooms further in when you keep your shot steady. It feels like you're being rewarded for picking your shots carefully in an original way different from holding your breath. It's incredibly minor, but seeing this game do something different is refreshing. It's hard not to compare this to Red Dead Redemption despite coming out a year prior, but there is one thing that Bound in Blood does better: dueling. In Redemption, I still struggle to understand how dueling works. I've watched tutorials, read instructions, and practiced carefully in-game, but it doesn't quite make sense to me. I understand that you're supposed to fill up a meter and carefully time your shots, filling up more of the bar than your opponent, but I never get better between duels. In Juarez, the dueling is much more simple, straightforward, and cinematic. You and your opponent move in a circle with the left stick, and you move your hand towards the gun with the right stick. When a bell is sounded, you grab your gun and shoot a single bullet, defeating your opponent. It's easy, but it's quite a lot of fun. It truly makes a player feel like a badass gunslinger, which I feel like the game was trying to do throughout. The rest of the gameplay, however, is surprisingly inoffensive, following first-person shooter tropes fairly closely. There's rail shooting segments and time button presses like you'd see in any other FPS, just done with a bit of Western flair. It's noticeably a lot harder to pump an enemy full of bullets when you have to pull the hammer back after each shot, and each weapon comes with a variety of benefits and challenge. It's a push for accuracy, again, though minor, that makes this game briefly shine.
And then at times the game wrecks all sense of forward narrative motion and just gives you an open world to hunt through.
There you can do various side missions or buy guns before moving on in the story, but it doesn't really hold any weight. It's sort of just a hallway in between two rooms of the story. It's a strange choice, and one that really doesn't do anything other than pad the 8-ish hour playtime. It's a shame really, because this is published but not developed by Ubisoft, the creators of arguably one of the best first-person sandbox series, Far Cry. I'm rarely one to compliment their work, but it would be really nice to have that world depth here. Either that or stay entirely linear. Like, this doesn't need to be a massive sandbox, but if you're gonna do it, at least try. Don't give me a litter box and a toy truck and tell me to have at it like you're doing me some big fucking favor. Also, while we're talking about just weird choices this game makes, why do horses act like a horse mask taped to an office chair? There's like zero resistance, and I'm not entirely convinced it isn't just hovering in the air there. In fact, a lot of movement feels just like that, and upon examining my shadow, I appear to be a gangly hovering ghost with legs twisting in the wind. There's something really off about this game's development. It's not offensive or bad, it's just weird.
Like graphically, for example, I can't help but be haunted by the soulless gaze of these character models.
And as I said before, enemies can be extremely hard to pick out, especially with everything being extremely bright or extremely dark. Also, the game relies very heavily on having a shallow depth of field. Like in cutscenes, backgrounds blur out literally before the character model sometimes, and I can't tell if that's so the developers had less to code or if it's an artistic choice, but either way it looks cheap. And I know the developers know this because they choose to leave a skip cutscene button up at the top right of the corner of every single cutscene, and it's huge. It's like they're embarrassed of the greasy monstrosities that they've created, and they try to shuffle you away from them as quickly as possible.
Now, I know I've been pretty tough on Bound in Blood, but I gotta say, it's just almost not quite, just barely in the ballpark of being okay.
It does both first-person shooter and western in such an unambitious way though, making it easier to pick on. With some extra polish, another rewrite, and just a better understanding of what it was trying to do, there'd be a real quality piece of western fiction here. But what we're left with is a ball of half-baked, incredibly average tropes and trends that do little more than make you hungry for something better. Think of it as a microwave meal. Yeah, it's fine and you're satisfied, but is it really how you wanted to spend your evening? Or did you want to spend it out on a nice date with your ex-wife that you still love?
All in all though, I'd say unless you've seen every Clint Eastwood movie or you have a bust of John Wayne on your bedside table, this might be the game that you want to play. If it's free. Or at least cheap.